Hello, I'm Felicity Cohen. I'm so excited to introduce you to my Wellness Warriors podcast. For over 20 years, I've been a passionate advocate for helping thousands of Australians find solutions to treating obesity and health-related complications through surgical intervention and holistic managed care. My podcast is dedicated to all the people, past, present and future, who have helped shape my journey and continue to inspire me to work consistently to achieve a healthier Australia in both adults and future generations. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to the Wellness Warriors podcast. Today it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Dan Neuffer. Welcome, Dan. Thank you so much for coming on board today.
Oh, you're welcome, Felicity. It's my pleasure to be on your podcast today.
Thank you. I'm very excited to unravel your story, which is fascinating. So you were born in Germany, grew up in Australia, or in Germany, Australia, a bit of a mix of the two?
Yeah, I was actually, oh goodness, I'm getting a big feedback here. I'm sorry about that. Every time I speak, it's coming straight through on the speakers. Did you perhaps want to turn your volume down at your end a little bit?
100%. Maybe we should.
Yeah, because I'm literally hearing every word I'm saying straight afterwards.
Is that better for you?
Let's see. Okay. Yeah, I don't hear myself, so that's great.
Hang on, I just need to turn it up a tiny bit so I can hear you, and then I'm going to start again.
Okay. Sorry about that. It's really hard to concentrate when you can hear yourself speaking immediately after you say a word, you know?
Is that okay for you?
Looks okay. Yep, I cannot hear myself.
I need a tiny bit louder. I'm so sorry. I'm just going to go like that.
Okay.
How's that?
Okay, let me hear. Can I hear myself? Is it coming through? Hello? No, it's good.
Okay, it's a tiny bit on the soft side, but I should be okay.
Okay, no worries.
Okay, all right. As long as you don't have any feedback, that's all good. All right, I will start all over again.
Okay, no worries.
Okay. Welcome to the Wellness Warriors podcast. Today it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dan Neuffer to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dan.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your wonderful podcast.
My pleasure. We've got an exciting story to share. Your whole journey is quite fascinating. You were born, first of all, in Australia and moved to Germany. Tell me a little bit about how much time you've spent where and your origins, first of all.
Yeah, well, I'm actually was born in Australia, so I'm an Aussie, but I I sound a little bit German because I grew up in Germany, and I came over here. So English is actually my second language.
Fantastic. So you were working, your professional life started out as a physicist. What took you into that area of professional career space, and what was it that drove you to that area originally?
Well, I guess I was good at crunching numbers. Even in high school, I liked maths, I liked physics, I liked the sciences, and my favorite show was Beyond 2000, if you remember that one.
Amazing.
And I was always very interested in lasers and things like that. So I studied lasers and optoelectronics at university, and then I worked in that field for some time. It's very narrow in Australia. There's a limited sort of number of jobs available. I ended up some years later going into the financial services industry as a number cruncher, so to say, and then I became a risk specialist, and then suddenly I moved into what I do now, which was wholly unexpected, I suppose.
So there was you were struck down literally with a whole plethora of a disease profile that included myalgic encephalomyelitis, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, etc. This whole group of diseases. And from what I understand, there was potentially an incident or a trigger that involved post a vaccination of some description or an immunization. Is that correct?
That is correct. But I mean, two things. First of all, correlation does not equal causation. And that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, I'm not saying that the vaccine didn't have an impact, but it wasn't the sole cause. So because otherwise, everyone would have that vaccination that I had would have an issue, and that's clearly not the case.
Sure.
So it was a contributing factor, and I guess the way I describe it, it was maybe the final nudge that pushed me over into this dysfunction that is this illness.
So what are some of the contributing factors that can lead to this group of conditions that you were dealing with?
Well, look, they're very varied. And I think that's part of the reason why the medical fraternity has kind of struggled with this illness, because one person will get it after a car accident, another person will get it after like a vaccination, another person will get it after they've had a virus, or after childbirth, or after a psychological stressor, or like a divorce or something like this. And so it's been very difficult for the medical community to come together and agree on what is causing the illness, what is the pathogenesis of the illness. However, the fact that we have such a large variety of triggers of the illness is really the biggest clue as to what I believe causes the illness.
It is really interesting because I think there's a lack of understanding overall regarding, for example, with fibromyalgia. I often hear people say to me, or there are doctors who are uncertain with regards to diagnosis, and that there are people who still brand or label this as some kind of a psychosomatic type of disease profile, and that there's a question mark over the validity of this disease and what it looks like. Can you talk me through why there's so much uncertainty regarding the diagnosis in the first place?
The problem is, well, these illnesses are often called an invisible illness. If I tell you I'm dizzy, how can you measure that? If I tell you I'm fatigued, how can you measure that? If I tell you I've got pain, how can you measure that? So the doctor has to basically go off what the patient says. Normally, if you say I've got heart disease, doctor will say, well, let me look at your heart. Yeah, you can do all kinds of tests. If you've got cancer, you can do tests. But if you have a disease that has symptoms that cannot easily be verified through a medical test, then that makes it difficult. That's the first step. The second step is that the patient community and the patient disease experience is heterogeneous. And so we have a big variety in symptoms. So there are, in fact, if you look at postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome and fibromyalgia and I say MECFS, but even some people will differentiate those two. Doctors don't even say that that's one illness. It's often considered different illnesses. And some doctors say it's the same illness, but many doctors will say they're different illnesses. And other illnesses like irritable bowel syndrome, in my view, also lay along the same spectrum. It's the same illness. But, how confusing is it? One person stands up and gets a tachycardia attack. One person says they've got pain. One person says they're fatigued. And one person says they've got issues with their bowel. How can this be the same illness? It's very confusing. And the problem is that in medicine, we tend to look at the symptoms. You don't do that in engineering or in physics. You don't look at the results. You look at the reason for them. And so maybe that was an advantage for me because I was looking at what could be causing all these symptoms as opposed to looking at the symptoms on their own.
So you would classify all of these under one umbrella and that they're all part of a group of one disease, really, in essence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's why you see people have multiple diseases, right? They'll say, oh, I've got hypothyroidism, and then I had irritable bowel syndrome, then I got chronic fatigue syndrome. How unlucky am I? And then I started getting POTS, and then I started getting fibromyalgia. I'm the unluckiest person on earth. you'd have to be really unlucky to have so many different illnesses, and the list goes on and on.
Yeah.
And yeah, the answer is they're not that unlucky because they've got one illness, just lots of different symptoms.
So you went on a journey of 6.5 to 7 years of dealing with being pretty critically unwell and sometimes bedridden. Can you talk me through what that 6.5 to 7? I can't even imagine. To me, that sounds like a whole lifetime. How did you deal with that? What did that look like? And how on earth did you actually cope to survive that's such a long period of illness?
Well, it's funny. I always thought it was long, and now I speak regularly to people who are sick 20, 30, and 40 years, and I kind of go, how are they doing that? Because I got to be honest. You say, how did I cope? How did I do it? My answer is not very well. Not very well. I did not deal with it very well. I found it extremely difficult. It was very scary. It was very confusing. You go to so many doctors. Some doctors just try their best to try and find out everything. I had such lovely doctors who tried to help me, and they just couldn't find anything, or they'd find something, and it ended up sort of being a dead end. And then you find other doctors who almost seem to roll their eyes at you. And then you try all the alternative healthcare practitioners, and you have similar experiences. You keep trying things, and it never goes anywhere. It never goes anywhere. You have periods of being quite ill, like as if you got a flu kind of thing. And then you got periods where you're better and you can almost kind of function. And then your baseline my baseline sort of seemed to go down over the years, and even then when you were feeling well, you were still kind of horrible, and then I had I guess the last period, about 5 years in, where I suddenly became severely ill, where I was bedbound, and that was quite a disturbing time of my life. I wasn't bedbound that long, but it was extremely severe. And
I can't even. I mean, that must have been horrifically frightening for you, because you kind of question, am I ever going to recover when you're faced with feeling that in that kind of situation, being bedbound, and the chronic fatigue obviously had hit you to the point where you must have had very little energy.
Well, to put it in perspective, I mean, first of all, I would say in my mind, I was not going to recover. Because, I mean, obviously, if I've been to all the doctors and everyone says, we don't know what causes this, we don't know what's wrong with you, you try all the treatments that you can think of, or try all these things, nothing works. Sooner or later, you have to accept the reality that you're just not going to get better. That's at least how I thought of it. So my, excuse me. So my aim was simply to live with it as best as I could. And then I became bedbound. And normally when you have these severe flare-ups, what I would do is, you struggle even with stimulation like sounds or people talking to you or lights. There's a lot of neurological components of the disease because of what I'm saying the disease is. And then you kind of want to just hide away from the world. But I was so ill, I was lying, I couldn't speak, I couldn't communicate really, I couldn't move my arms. And I remember lying there feeling my heart like laboring, and I was like, it was the first time that I ever didn't want to be alone. So it was a pretty scary time. I was like that for, I don't know how long, it's a long time ago now, but I think it would have been about a month where I was that severe. And I was probably more or less in bed for about 3 months. And I had crawled out for the first time at Christmas. I often tell this story. I crawled out for Christmas. I had 2 young kids, 2 and 6. That's when Christmas is at its best. And of course, I couldn't help with anything like the food or anything like that. I was just sitting on the sofa, but I couldn't even join them at the table for dinner. And when it came to unwrapping the presents and the big moment for the kids and they're excited, I couldn't fake a smile. Now, I think anyone who's a parent would understand that you can always fake a smile at Christmas when the kids have unwrapped the present, like, but I was so low in energy, I just couldn't do anything. And I thought at that moment, no, this is not something I can just live with. Yeah.
So you actually made a conscious decision to then seek out a pathway for recovery, and that was something that you worked at until you were committed, you were determined, and that was something that you actually sought out yourself.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'll be honest, it felt like a little bit of a delusion of grandeur, right? I mean, I don't have any background in medicine. And I said to my wife, because I didn't want to try any more treatments, because I'd already tried that. You go through these waves of trying everything, and then you get exhausted emotionally, mentally at the disappointment, and then you just stop again, and then you try again. But I was done with that, and I was like, I don't want to try treating symptoms or these stories of what could be causing it. And I said, there must be a root cause for this. And I said to her, I'm going to find what that is. I'd seen that movie, Lorenzo's Oil. I don't know if you've seen that with Nick Nolte, where two parents, they have a very ill son, and they seek to find a cure for their son. I was kind of inspired by that. And I told my wife, and I don't know, like I said, it seemed kind of silly, given the fact that I don't have a medical background. But she looked at me and she goes, yes, Dan, I think you will. And I remember that moment going, uh-oh, what have I done? And then I started my research from there.
So what did you find? What did you find, and how did you actually get to that, point in time where you felt that you were well again and obviously functioning as you'd hoped to?
Well, I guess the first thing is I started to look at all the things we know. Like you mentioned, there's all these different triggers. And I'm like, well, how can you have so many different triggers for one illness? At the time, I hadn't necessarily bundled all of these things together in my mind, just because that was my experience of having these different components of the illness. And then I looked at the dysfunctions, people have adrenal insufficiency, people have cellular metabolism problem, and people have, the list is endless of all these, hypothyroidism, people have gut issues. I'm like, what's causing that? And rather than looking at treating it, I was like, well, why is that happening? And then why is that happening? And what I found is that whenever, no matter what part of the illness or symptoms are pursued, at the end, I seem to get to the same point. And so I started to say, well, this must be the root cause of the illness, because when you dig deep enough, that's where you get to. Or I'd look at like treatments that we know have some impact, like magnesium. I started taking magnesium. I remember I was like a 80, 90-year-old man, I couldn't even stand up. Oh, so stiff, and I couldn't stand up in the morning. And I started really mega dosing magnesium, because there was plenty of evidence that this can be helpful for many people. And sure enough, I found myself standing up in the mornings, and I could stand up straight. And the strange thing was I wasn't, because I was so used to acting like a, stiff hunchback. I'm like, why am I doing this? I can walk normally now, But then I'm like, why would I be low in magnesium? How is magnesium used? What determines how much magnesium you have, right? Are we losing the magnesium too fast? Are we not getting it? What's the story, Because other people don't have to supplement. They're fine. And the common theme was basically the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is what controls your heart. So for POTS, it is recognized by doctors that POTS is dysautonomia, a dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system. However, for CFS and fibromyalgia, that's not necessarily recognized, even though the medical scientific evidence is really building for this. But I looked at it, and whether it was your hormonal expressions or whatever it was, it always came back to the autonomic nervous system. And I thought, okay, this is where the problem must reside.
So where do we get our magnesium from in our normal day-to-day dietary intake? Where do we find magnesium?
Well, magnesium is found in a range of foods. I mean, there was an interesting thing I found is when you look at the molecule for chlorophyll, and you look at the molecule for hemoglobin, I think it is, they actually are these huge, big molecules, and they look identical. The only difference is that the hemoglobin has the ferritin in the center, an iron, and the chlorophyll has a magnesium. So that was kind of an interesting experience somewhere along the line. But basically, you get it from a range of foods. But it wasn't really about, I was eating the same food as everyone else. So I wasn't really pursuing, what am I eating here? And it was really a case of having to supplement to make a difference. And many people treat their symptoms, Felicity, like with changing their diet, eating nutritious food, like you were suggesting, and other treatments, but it doesn't return them to wellness because they have to address the root cause, which is this brain dysfunction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally understand, magnesium is so important for us, but what makes me wonder is that, we're supplementing a lot, and not just with magnesium, but, with things like zinc and selenium, and that so often we hear that our soil is so depleted that, you've got to make sure that it's the right opportunity so Brazil nuts have to come from Brazil so that we get the right amount of selenium in our diets. And it does concern me that maybe there's certain areas of farming that have changed over decades that are preventing us from getting all of these elements that we need on a daily basis and meeting those RDI of, all of those things that we need.
Well, it's a really, really good point you make, because I was speaking to a doctor some years ago who was a specialist in orthomolecular medicine, and he looked at zinc in particular and the role in health. And the normal ranges that we see now compared to the ranges to 50 years ago are very different.
Correct.
So you can be not deficient on paper because you're in the range of what's normal, but the normal is not in a good place necessarily. And yeah, there must certainly be big changes to nutrition. And supplementing helps, of course, but you got to understand that many supplements are not so bioavailable as natural foods. Even if you look at magnesium, there's so many different types of magnesium, and as a point in case, I mean, if you take magnesium oxide and you want to take a large amounts, then you're going to get very familiar with the toilet because most of it's going to go through you, right? Whereas you take another form of magnesium, it's much easier for your body to absorb. But the question is still, why is it low, compared to the next person?
So what were some of the other avenues, pathways, mechanisms for recovery? What did you find?
Well, so once this gave me a focus, I was like, okay, there's all these dysfunctions. I can start treating those. And I started to work with an integrative doctor, started to look at healing my gut. I started to change my diet. I started to do all these type of supplementing for cellular metabolism because we know we've got, I don't want to say necessarily mitochondrial dysfunction, but let's just say non-efficient cellular metabolism. There's a lot of lactate in the body and even in the brain. It would be suggested from research, and that all spells to that the energy metabolism isn't working, which is why people often feel fatigued and the pain. But then ultimately I was like, okay, well, there's got to be, if the brain is dysfunctioning, so I'm saying that's the autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system regulates how you respond to a stressor. And so in the morning, it wakes you up, gets you going, right? And then at night, it calms you down so you can get to sleep, right? And of course, none of this works. People can't get up in the morning, and at night they can't sleep. So there's another clue. And so my focus was then on saying, okay, I'll treat the symptoms. I've done that before with mediocre success, but I'll do it anyway. But then I was like, okay, I've got to treat the brain. And I noticed that there were very strange behaviors that I was engaging in. One of the things that really helped me sort of make this connection to the brain was I remember brushing my little daughter's teeth, and as I'm brushing it, I noticed that I was like, like tense. It was like I was diffusing a nuclear bomb, and I was holding my breath and all of this. And once I caught on to this, I'm like, what a strange thing to do. Like, why would I be doing this? This is such a bizarre thing to do, you know? And I was like, oh, well, don't do that. And then I found myself doing that all over the place. And all of this led to me going, there's something wrong with my brain. It was also, of course, the smells. You know, I had smells like a bloodhound. You know, my dog, when we open a chicken, you know, she comes running from the next room. My puppy dog, right? She can smell the chicken immediately in the house. You know what? I wasn't that far behind. It was very odd, yeah. Visual stimulation, all of these kind of things. And this is very common. People will recognize this when they have this illness. So I said, okay, well, how can I possibly change the brain? And so I started by developing a range of techniques to change how I responded to stimulus.
Okay.
And I noticed also that I had this crazy blood sugar business, right? Which also can go into that whole cellular metabolism, you know, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome. Although I think it's variable how bad this is with people in this illness. So I started to look at my diet, and I noticed that I was also very reactive. Like, I mean, you know, a normal person, their blood sugar dips, you know, the body puts out the appropriate hormones and it responds. It's not a problem. Yeah, you can not eat for many hours, but when I didn't eat, like, I crashed. Like, and the next day I could be in bed, and so it was like, okay, well, how can I possibly tell my brain not to react to my blood sugar? I mean, how do you do that? I don't even know it's happening. But what I found is that when I was able to retrain my brain to react to other stimulus, whether it be light, sound, or behaviors, or even psychological stressors, it appeared that it was translating to other uncontrolled stimulus, whether it be my gut or whether it be my blood sugar. And one other brain training thing that I focused a lot on was mindfulness meditation. And it was very peculiar to me how impossibly difficult this was. I'm like, what is wrong with me? Seriously, like you know, you're supposed to just concentrate. And you know, we have a lot of cognitive problems with this illness. Like, I mean, I remember once being in a meeting and someone asked me, oh, what's the name? Oh, what are your kids' names? You have 2 kids? And I didn't know. I mean, imagine that. How can you make an excuse for not knowing the name of your own children? I mean, you cannot imagine the amount of panic that goes on in that moment, because you're like, there's no excuse you can make. You know what I mean? Oh, I can't just remember my kids. So there's a lot of these cognitive problems. But when I went to start meditating, and I literally couldn't hold my concentration for 1 second.
Wow.
I tried to just count my concentrate just on my steps as I walk through the house, and say, oh, how many steps can I take? And just count my steps and focus my concentration on that without wandering or whatever. And I couldn't get to 2. Like 2 steps. And I'm like, this is not normal, right?
Wow. So in essence, your process or your pathway to recovery and to managing and moving forward was a lot of brain training.
It was a lot of brain training. And I think it's some of these things are sometimes a little bit misunderstood, Felicity, right? So many people will look at that and say, some people take brain training as being like a psychological approach. But if you look at, for instance, a person who's had a stroke, and they have to learn to walk, and they have to affect neuroplasticity, I mean, you wouldn't term that a psychological approach, right? So, and many people who use mind-body approaches, who also have come to recognize that ANS dysfunction is central, they will often use purely a psychological approach. However, you have to understand your brain responds the same way to psychological stresses as it does to physiological stresses. So to me, it didn't make sense to say, oh, I'm going to work on the psychological side, when all this crazy stuff in my body was going on that was making my brain freak out. Yeah. And again, this explains why people get the illness in so many different ways.
Yeah.
And Felicity, why people recover in so many different ways. So we don't have a single magic cure for this illness. And you'll hear stories where people did X, Y, and Z and they recovered. And you're like, well, if that was really the cure, then we'd all know about it, right? Because you try X, Y, and Z and it doesn't work for you. And you're like, well, they must have had a different illness. Yes. Well, they haven't had a different illness, but what they've had is different predominant triggers. And so it's about resolving those particular triggers. So if one person, for instance, has uncontrolled type 2 diabetes, then part of their recovery is likely to be getting that managed more effectively. Another person might have post-traumatic stress disorder, and so they will have to resolve that. Yeah. Another person might have infections, a gut or candida or viral infections, so that'll be part of it. Yeah. So there seems to be two camps in this world, Felicity. There's the one camp who wants to treat every physical dysfunction and fix it, which most of us try for many years until we finally give up. And then there's the other camp who says it's just do all this psychological stuff or mental stuff. And both groups have some success, but it's my view that the best approach is, of course, to do both.
So the program that you've written, that sounds like it's been incredibly effective to date, and I've seen some of the testimonials that are phenomenal. And as you mentioned, some people who've been sufferers for 20 and 30 years have seen incredible relief by getting involved and utilising your program and working with you through that program. How are you training people to get through this kind of condition? What does it look like to do that?
Well, that's such a good question. And I think that really shows your background, because it's not in life about having the answers, is it? Right? I mean, if we look at, obesity, for instance, it's not about having the answers to obesity, right? Because most people know what the answer to obesity is. It's about being able to utilize the strategies. It's about being able to do it. And obviously that's not so easy, right? And when you are physically diminished, mentally, cognitively diminished, and dare I say emotionally and perhaps even spiritually diminished, how do you do anything? So one of the key things about the program is that people can do it from their own home, and that they get one lesson per day. And that lesson is typically 30 to 50 minutes. And it's an education program where we first of all focus on understanding how you got ill, why you got ill, and all of that sort of thing. And then we talk about specific strategies and how they can connect with the healthcare providers for better outcomes and move towards wellness. In terms of the outcomes, it's not done in a clinical setting. So frankly, we don't actually know. But what I would say is, the overwhelming feedback we have is that people make good progress, and we have people who make full recoveries. I don't, however, want people to look at my website and see these testimonials and go, oh, yeah, because some of these testimonials are people who are very enthusiastic sharing their story because they had a very fast result. Like you see people who are sick for 30 years, 20% functioning, and 90 days later, they're like hiking the mountains every day at the age of 72, and you go, wow, that sounds like a miracle cure. I have an old saying that I'm sure if it sounds too good to be true, it usually is, right? But there are reasons why some people do so well, and we teach that in the program. I think a more realistic expectation might be for someone to have good progress in 6 months and maybe a fuller recovery process in 12 to 18 months. But we can't guarantee anything, because if there are other complications, they need to resolve that with the healthcare professionals.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's now being used in, I think, over 50 countries around the world. We've got, And the interesting thing about it is that there's a lot of people from the medical fraternity who are using it for themselves. Just spoke with a top neurologist from overseas who has been specializing in treating CFS as a consultant, and who's now referring all their patients to the program as part of their practice. So we have people like that from all over the world. It's a shame that we're not seeing it more in mainstream medicine, but the problem is that it's complicated. It's a complicated illness, and it doesn't have a quick fix. And many doctors try really hard to help, but they don't have a magic pill here. Yeah, and so it is a personal process. Recovery is a personal process.
Oh, look, I think it's amazing that you've actually had an opportunity to utilise your own personal experience to raise awareness of this group of diseases. And I've learnt something by, exploring your personal journey. I didn't actually know myself that all of these conditions were grouped together under one umbrella. So it's really interesting to see, and maybe it's, different. It might obviously play out differently in each individual, but under that umbrella. And clearly the solution, or what you're offering in terms of pathway and the course to hopefully recovery, is something that so many more people are going to be exposed to. This is obviously your full-time career right now is supporting people through your program.
Yeah, that's right. Look, for many years I was informally supporting people all over the world, sort of pro bono work, and that was very difficult to sustain. And people kept saying to me, Dan, we need more. Doing this one-on-one, it's not easy. It takes too much time. And they kept saying, oh, can you create a program? Can you create a program? And then eventually I caved and I did it. The program is very comprehensive. It is not like, oh, learn this and it's a quick fix. It rolls out over a period of months, and it keeps building your education, keeps building strategies, because we're trying to do it in bite-sized chunks. It's too hard when you're ill to do a million things. So you've got to get well enough to do more. Yes, and you've got to take your wellness, and instead of spending it on whatever, you've got to say, I've got to reinvest it in my recovery. So it's a step-by-step process.
What does your daily practice look like to self-manage now, so that you potentially never have a relapse again in the future? What does a normal day look like to you?
This is a really interesting question. And this talks about, what is the difference between cure or management, because many people will say that they overcame their illness, but actually what they've done is they've stopped all the triggers, because there's a range of triggers, as I shared with you, and they basically learn to avoid all those triggers and live carefully so that they can stay well, right? That's not the same as somebody who is fully well. Someone who's fully well, he doesn't have to worry what he eats or whether he doesn't sleep well, right? So, I've been well now for over 10 years, and frankly, I've had a bit of a health problem over the last few years. I had appendicitis, and since then I've had some issues in my abdomen, some pain that hasn't been resolved, most likely adhesions, and a very stressful time, very, very stressful time. And I have managed to stay robust. I haven't relapsed into the illness. I don't actually have any specific strategies to maintain my health. I just live my life normally now. But I do recommend people in the program to maintain the strategies they learn for a period of time. Get fully well, stay fully well for a year, stay fully well for 2, lose the strategies gradually, and your brain will get more and more used to operating normally, and you get more and more solid. But yeah, I think there comes a point where you don't really have to treat yourself like a delicate daisy anymore. So
amazing. I'm really excited I feel like we've kind of lifted a lid today, because it's something that I wasn't aware of, and I guarantee there's a lot of people out there who are still so unaware of how these conditions are interrelated, and that they can be treated holistically and in a whole different approach to self-manage that's a little bit different. And I hope that we can find today in this conversation that there'll be people out there who will reach out for your program, because I guarantee there's a lot more people to reach who need your program to support them. So thank you so much for that.
You're very welcome, Felicity.
I have a final question for you today that I like to ask of all of my podcast guests. Dan, what does wellness mean to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. To me, wellness means not knowing about it, not thinking about it. That's what wellness means to me, all right? Because I think when you can just engage in life without an awareness of wellness, you've probably got it.
Oh, I love that. Fabulous.
It's quite
Dan,
the opposite.
thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was great to talk to you today.
Thank you for joining the Wellness Warriors podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you online with us. If you've enjoyed the series, please leave your review, subscribe and follow, and we look forward to sharing many more stories with you in the future.